En esta ocasión nos reunimos para escuchar a Manuel Callahan, Manolo, quien nos comparte su propuesta y perspectiva sobre las zonas temporáneas autónomas de la producción de conocimiento, el aprendizaje convivencial en la coyuntura zapatista, con la cual esperamos sea un incentivo que despierte nuestras reflexiones, análisis y cuestionamientos al respecto. Manolo es investigador enfocado a las múltiples guerras que coinciden en y a través de la frontera de México-Estados Unidos, así como las luchas relacionadas de la comunidad étnicamente mexicana en México profundo. Pertenece al Centro de Investigación Convivial y la Autonomía, un centro de estudios que promueve estrategias conviviales de aprendizaje, investigación y acción directa. Les recordamos que una vez concluida la conferencia, se abrirá la sesión al diálogo con los participantes, el cual será alimentado por sus preguntas y comentarios. Estas preguntas podrán ser formuladas solicitando el micrófono a las asistentes que se encuentran a los costados del auditorio. Antes de iniciar la conferencia, me gustaría avisarles que las constancias de su participación a los talleres se entregarán al finalizar la última conferencia a las 7 de la noche. Con este preámbulo, damos comienzo a la sexta conferencia magistral dentro del programa del XXIII Simposium de Educación. Cedo el micrófono a Manolo.
Before I begin, I want to alert everybody to first thank Nilda for that introduction, but also alert everyone that if you'd like to view some of the slides that I'll have on your screen, whatever, your phone or your laptop or your iPad or what have you, you can enter into the web page here, where the URL is there, peardeck.com/join, and then just enter the code RJXYV, and you should be able to view whatever is on the screen on your own screen. Well, let me begin by first thanking everybody for all the hard work that they've done to put this conference together. There are several people that have worked extremely hard and have been very gracious and very patient and have gone beyond the call of duty to make it possible for me to be here, as well as the others, and to be part of this very exciting space, thinking through how we're learning together and how we're changing learning. And I'm saying learning to kind of move away from the idea of education. I want to kind of take up Manish's point about education being a very serious crime of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, and try to explore that question more. But again, I want to thank Malu also for working very hard with me and preparing the translation, the simultaneous translation. I know it's difficult work to do. And again, thank everyone for all the hard work they've done. And it's wonderful to be on this campus. And I'd like to also thank the university as a whole. It's very wonderful, it's very warm, very inviting campus. I've enjoyed it very much. I should also confess that I went to Jesuit schools as a young person. I went to Jesuit high school and a Jesuit college, so I feel very much at home in a Jesuit environment among the Society of Jesus. It's very good to be back in some ways. So that by way of confession, that you'll notice, I hope, you'll notice that in some of what I share, you'll see some of some ideas and some practices that are peculiar to the Jesuit way of teaching and learning and entering the world in fellowship and in community. So that's my confession. I'd also like to offer a very sincere apology, and I mean it sincerely, and I'm also deeply embarrassed about it, but I want to apologize for having to present in English. My Spanish is terrible, as those of you who have heard me over the course of the talleres. It's very obvious that my Spanish is terrible, and it's something that I struggle with. But I'm hoping that this trip, this trip will turn it around, and I'll open up my spirit and open up my, break free of my colonized mind and just start talking and loosen up the tongue and not be so worried about making mistakes. So in this case, and I feel like although I was managing the talleres to some degree, I didn't want to burden you with my rudimentary Spanish and not be able to convey fully some of the work that we're doing in the Universidad de la Tierra Califas, and also what we're doing with the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy. But again, I apologize for all the inconvenience of the simultaneous translation. I wanted to also kind of think about how to think out loud with everyone, all of you who have been participating, and other folks other people who have given the main presentations, and all the talleristas that have facilitated all the several workshops. Wanted to kind of try to think out loud with you all about some questions, some reflections that we struggle with in Universidad de la Tierra. So in that sense, I don't have a formal presentation. I have to, one more confession, that when I arrived, I was somewhat taken aback by how formal and elaborate and very sophisticated the conference is as a process, as a space of learning. Not that it wouldn't be sophisticated, of course it would be, but the idea is that many of us are much more accustomed and committed to organizing ourselves in less formal spaces. So I'm part of a community that in many instances we insist that we change the space, because of course that's central to any pedagogy, is managing the space. And this space we think of as a transmission pedagogy, and we want to talk more, or engage more what we call a network pedagogy, or what I've been calling temporary autonomous zones of knowledge production. And that's what I hope to kind of talk about today by kind of sharing with you some reflections. And I want to share reflections in 4 key areas. I want to first kind of situate the discussion to some degree, and this will necessarily be brief, but just to try to raise a few questions about what I've been calling the Zapatista conjuncture. And I'll explain what I mean by Zapatista conjuncture. I also would like to share with you some ideas that have kind of emerged out of our struggle, preguntando, caminando with the Zapatistas, and that is what we're calling loosely Zapatista civic pedagogy. It's an unnecessarily elaborate theoretical concept, but it's something that we can play with, and it helped kind of focus some ideas and some tools, some convivial tools, I'll argue, that the Zapatistas have been sharing with us over the course of, well, really since 1983, but actually publicly sharing them with us since 1994 up to the present. After we've kind of situated kind of what I think we need to think about in terms of our struggle in the present moment, then I would like to talk a little bit and share with you the actual strategy or practice, if you will, praxis, I suppose we could say praxis would be more lefty, kind of be a more leftist, we'll say praxis, of Universidad de la Tierra Califas. I want to share with you what it actually is. What do we mean by Universidad de la Tierra? What's our experience been in activating Universidad de la Tierra Califas. And as you know, Universidad de la Tierra Califas is an extension of Universidad de la Tierra Oaxaca, and to some degree Chiapas. I'm very well aware you all are all very good friends with my dear friend and I was going to say teacher, but I don't think that would be the word to use. Friend, in every sense of the word, Gustavo Esteva. Let me admit, I've learned a great deal from him, and you'll hear much of his wisdom in what I want to share today with you, and what we're trying to activate and work through and have a more profound understanding of in California, in Califas. After that, if there's time, I'd like to share with you very briefly, just as a kind of provocation, how we're applying what I just talked about in terms of Universidad de la Tierra Califas and what I've been calling insurgent learning and convivial research that we've learned from the Zapatistas, how that might apply to the classroom, to the university classroom. If I understood it correctly, it was revealed that I'm a lecturer, a part-time at San Jose State University. We're going to go on strike in about a month because all of us are underpaid. And I'm particularly underpaid because I'm a lecturer. I'm not a full faculty member. But I'm teaching a class, quote-unquote teaching. I don't like to use the language teaching or students, but I'm facilitating a learning space in the Department of Mexican-American Studies. And I wanted to share with you just some kind of ideas and a practical application of what it is that we're doing in the ethnic studies classroom, the Mexican-American Studies classroom, where we're trying to apply or make more available what we're learning in the struggle with the Zapatistas and with Unitierra Oaxaca. So I hope that makes sense, yeah? And again, I apologize for my English. Before I begin on the reflections that I want to share about the Zapatista conjuncture, Zapatista pedagogy, Universidad de la Tierra Califas, and the Mexican-American Studies classroom, before I begin with that, I wanted to also follow and try to engage the process that Manish kind of initiated for us when he shared some portion of his journey. I imagine he could have talked all day because his journey is a very complex one, but he shared, it seemed like, one portion of his journey in relation to the kind of work we're doing around alternatives to education and reclaiming learning. So I wanted to share with you a portion of my own journey that I think speaks to some of the struggle that we've been facing and contextualizes, it situates kind of what was the connection, what was the motivation for us to claim or engage, or maybe engage is a better word, engage Universidad de la Tierra Califas. And really that begins with my efforts. Well, it begins, I was a teacher. I taught at a school School for Learning Disabled in the United States. So it's already an alternative education site. And I taught when I left college. As soon as I got out of college, I started teaching there. I taught for some years, 4 or 5 years. And then I was able to experiment with all different radical kinds of teaching methods because it was a very small private school. So I was satisfied that I had kind of learned some things about teaching that had troubled me. And then I wanted to go on and move into the university and get a PhD and become part of a more active intellectual political life. So I went to University of Texas at Austin, and eventually I'll get my PhD there. But what I wanted to mention is while I was there, immediately many of us were involved in trying to confront, we were confronting the university system, and in particular, we were confronting the Mexican-American faculty. And our argument, or our concern back in those days, was that what had happened in the Mexican-American studies programs across the country was that they had become ineffective as a result of they had lost any kind of connection to the community, and they were kind of had become corrupt with caciquismo. And so we began fighting our faculty, and every university campus across the country was inflamed, engulfed in struggle in all of the research centers and the departments that were ethnic studies departments, African American studies departments, Mexican American studies departments, Chicano studies departments. And I was very much part of that struggle. And we were fighting to take over the research centers, we were fighting to take over the departments, and again, arguing that the faculty had lost any kind of connection, and that it created a situation where they were just taking care of themselves and were doing little for our quote unquote our community. So that was very much our struggle, and what we were doing, we realized at a critical moment that we were fighting our own faculty and actually gaining nothing ourselves. We were fighting each other, and realized that that's exactly what the university wanted us to do. It was trying to divide us and manage us, and then of course we were still very much dependent on the university for resources for any kind of project. So I say that to kind of situate one project that we started to claim and we started to develop, and that was the Advanced Seminar on Chicano Research. And the Advanced Seminar, as you all know, an advanced seminar, I'm not quite sure what the translation would be in Spanish, but an advanced seminar in the U.S. context is a learning space. It's a seminar that's convened by the most prestigious, the most well-funded faculty in a major research institution. And so since we were all graduate students and undergraduate students and community members, we were playing with the idea, we were just joking with the idea that we could convene an advanced seminar. But the point was that we convened the advanced seminar, and we linked that advanced seminar as a kind of autonomous learning space. And we linked it to a tertulia that we had organized, where we had an open, ongoing space that we had organized at a local bar. And with the two spaces, we argued that we could, on our own terms, without any funding, without any authorization, without any sanction, and really in some ways in opposition to what was happening in the formal university, we could do everything that the campus research center, department, and could do. And I mentioned that because that was a critical moment for us when we started as Manish was saying on Wednesday, when we began our unlearning. And we at that moment, we stopped to see ourselves as students. And we saw ourselves as learners, and saw ourselves as our own authorities and actively in charge of our own intellectual journeys. And at that moment, then, of course, we also stopped fighting our faculty. So we had established the Advanced Seminar in Chicano Research and networked it with several tertulias over time when the Zapatistas will emerge on the scene in '94. And so when the Zapatistas arrive, they become very public, we felt that we were affirmed in our efforts to try to create autonomous spaces and to try to organize ourselves to confront, at the time, what we were confronting and researching was what we were arguing was a low-intensity war that was directed at the Chicano community, the Mexicano community, and the African-American community in the U.S. And so we were convinced that we had succeeded on some level in creating a path for ourselves that we could take control of our own learning and find essentially a new way of doing politics, which is something that the Zapatistas will which was the Zapatistas will develop over time, emerge over time. So I just wanted to mention that because that is in some ways the seed that will kind of take root and will flower, if you will, when we finally organize ourselves as Universidad de la Tierra Califa. So we were beginning our path of unlearning in that moment. So let me talk a little bit. I just wanted to kind of situate that, in part because I also wanted to kind of remind us or alert us to the fact that in ethnic studies we have everything that we have fought for over the years since the 60s, since the 1960s. In ethnic studies, we've achieved everything that we have fought for. In every campus, we have a department, a research center, we have a student activist center, and we have a professional national association that serves Mexican American studies or Chicano studies. So we are included in some ways in the university. But the reality is, while we have achieved all that, and that was, of course, everything that was imagined in terms of the battle plan, that was the Plan de Santa Barbara that was issued in 1969. So we've achieved everything that plan had proposed in the late 60s. And in reality, we have little to show for that. So we've occupied the university, we've been included in the university space, and we have few resources that we control ourselves. And of course, we're overworked. Many of us are alienated. There's few departments that get along well, that are convivial, and that people are able to work together. There's very few departments that are functioning with any kind of solidarity or conviviality. So it's worth noting that while we have all, on some level, some success, the African American community and the Latino community are worse off now than they were in the 1960s. Our communities suffer more from structural inequalities in the present moment than we did in 1965, despite our success in having achieved some level of inclusion. So I wanted to mention that because that's part of the crisis that we find ourselves in. We have some achievements that we can claim, and we're now very much included and very much present in the university. At the same time, we're present at the very moment, we've succeeded and we've arrived at the very moment that the university has been in crisis, right? So that the university is very clearly in a neoliberal, we talk about it as the neoliberal university. We no longer recognize the university that we're in. We're in a neoliberal university, very much in the sense that it's the McUniversity, like McDonald's, like Manish was saying, Mc Education. We're in a McUniversity where the students are consumers, and they're very much encouraged to be consumers, and they're very much, the university is central to making sure that the neoliberal cultural attitudes, the political rationality, and the kind of social practice of neoliberalism is inculcated, is articulated, is confirmed politically, culturally, through the university in constructing and advancing what Wendy Brown calls the American nightmare, and that is that the university is producing a citizen consumer, and meaning that students are on the path to some version of citizenship, and they do that if they can claim whiteness, and they're doing that, of course, through consuming and through consumption. So related to the McUniversity and the kind of crisis of the neoliberal university is, of course, what's happening to faculty and how faculty are being super exploited in that context in terms of what we call flexibilization. More faculty are part-time and so on. So that's, I think, a theme that's very familiar to folks. I don't think it's worth going over too much. But I think it's important to mention that that's a central or critical element of what I've been calling the precaritization of knowledge. So the very moment that the university is in crisis is also the moment that and this has been already discussed at many spaces throughout this conference, how knowledge production and the circulation of information is being commodified and privatized, right? So that more and more students are expected to buy whatever access to information in our everyday lives, and this was the discussion by Manuel yesterday, our everyday lives, even our moments of leisure and conviviality are being colonized and occupied by capital, so that they're very much mediated by some form of abstraction and some form of capitalist apparatus or device, or essentially commodity, right? So that's also something that we need to pay very close attention to, that precaritization of knowledge can be no better illustrated than what I've invited you to do, and that is I've occupied your capital. I have as well, I've been facilitating the occupation by capital, in this case Pear Deck, a company that we use and we're encouraged to use in the university. But this idea of Pear Deck is inviting you to, it's inviting you to consume and to take in and have our discussion and our reflections and our thinking out loud mediated by your device. And then, of course, the trick is to occupy your device. And this is all we try to do as students. We try to colonize their phones so they won't be on the phone when we're talking. And we're trying to teach them. So, but I'm not joking. I'm partly joking, partly serious. I do have some slides that I will show you. And again, I have to apologize that the slides are in English. I didn't have time to translate them. But with regards to the precaritization of knowledge, another element of the precaritization of knowledge that we need to take very seriously, of course, is the idea of biopiracy. So we come from the Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley in California is the symbol kind of what we're talking about in terms of precaritization of knowledge. And the idea, quite simply, is that knowledge is being privatized. Biopiracy is a good example, and southern part of the San Francisco Bay Area is the central hub of the biopiracy that's taking place in Latin America and Mexico, right? The idea of privatizing DNA or privatizing biological materials and so on, right? So that's another critical element of the precaritization of knowledge. Then I think the other point to make is that when we're thinking about how knowledge is being commodified and information is being privatized, and the University is kind of articulating all of that process together in facilitating the production of a consuming citizen, we have to read that moment against the resistances that are taking place, and how in fact capital is trying to impose itself on a resisting subject. I'm going to offer it that way because, of course, I'm an autonomist. Then the idea is that capital is trying to occupy our everyday lives, as that was the point yesterday. And I think part of that resistance is, while we're thinking of while we're trying to understand the precaritization of knowledge, we're also doing that while we're claiming knowledge commons. So we're in a moment where more and more knowledge commons are emerging. And I think what that also means is that people are very much committed to finding new ways to learn. And I think this conference speaks to exactly that moment, and where people are very consciously part of a movement, a larger struggle, insisting that, or interrogating education and insisting that there might be an alternative. And then again, for us, the alternative is to kind of escape education, as Gustavo says, to escape education. And then what we're saying in reply to Gustavo is that we need to reclaim learning. So part of that is to abandon the language entirely of education and to kind of try to invent or claim a new language. And the idea, of course, is to do that together. So that I think kind of sums up loosely and very briefly the idea of the Zapatista conjuncture. Except to add that alongside the struggle around knowledge and information against its commodification and privatization, and an emergence of knowledge commons, I think that we also have to take into account what has happened since '94 and the arrival of the Zapatistas, right? And in that sense, I think one of the kind of key elements is that we're also now in a context where we're no longer so committed to solidarity politics. We've moved, the term we use is we've moved beyond solidarity. That doesn't mean that we're not also addressing or taking care of or managing solidarity questions or solidarity issues. We're still very much active in, acts of solidarity, but at the same time, we're moved beyond solidarity. We're very consciously, very clearly thinking about our struggles locally. We're trying to root down and confront the worst excesses of capitalism and the state in our own local areas, our own local terrain. So I think that's important to keep in mind that we're no longer thinking about, at least in the United States and in the global north, we're no longer just thinking about how we can help those who are less fortunate than us in the global south, which is kind of an offensive way of thinking anyway, and we're starting to think about our own struggles locally. So we've kind of gone beyond solidarity in that sense. And of course, we have also very much been a part of a disruption of the traditional left and the investment that the traditional left claimed about taking over state power and doing that in very kind of highly organized, hierarchical political organizations that were very ideologically rigid. And I think it's very clear, and we can talk about that for in another time, and there's a lot to be said, but as we're confronting the precaritization of knowledge, witnessing the emergence of knowledge commons, we're doing it in a context where the political terrain has changed dramatically. And we're now more autonomous, more horizontal, less hierarchical. And I think that lends itself to finding new ways of learning and new ways out of education. So I think that kind of defines the Zapatista conjuncture to some degree, because of course much of that is articulated around the provocations that are made available by the Zapatistas since 1994. So I'm going to assume some knowledge. I'm going to assume that people have some knowledge of the Zapatistas, and I'm trying not to get into too great a detail because I'm going to run out of time. But I wanted to talk about something that we've been developing and thinking through at Universidad de la Tierra Califas, and that's what we call Zapatista civic pedagogy. And the idea of this Zapatista civic pedagogy is, it's certainly it seems like it's unnecessarily elaborate term to talk about what we want to share and think about. But we think about it as a way to let me find my. Here we go. Kind of think about it as a way to we try to think of it more as how the Zapatista, a way of talking about the Zapatistas, so we're not necessarily narrating the Zapatistas. Our concern is that we don't want to just narrate the Zapatistas as either heroes or failures. We want to be able to engage the Zapatistas and again, learn with the Zapatistas, and to do that in a way that it's clear to us how can we understand in a more profound way what the Zapatista struggle has been over the years, let's say since 1983. And so the idea is that we can think of Zapatista civic pedagogy to some degree as a living theory. And what we mean by living theory is, like any theory, it's a theory that tries to define the conditions that we struggle under and struggle against, and those conditions articulated or explained as a provocation so that we can change them. But we say it's a living theory in the sense that we do, of course, all of that. We state the condition and we try to think of it as a provocation to change it, but at the same time we refuse to impose a future when we finally make a claim about that theory, that theoretical framework. So we're not imposing a future in the notion of a living theory. So we're thinking we can apply that idea to a Zapatista civic pedagogy, because the idea is just to try to orient ourselves about what is it that we can read in the Zapatistas that they're able to advance and share. It's also another way to think. We can think of it, of course, in terms of a pedagogy as a metaphor, the idea of what exactly is it that is being shared as a process of learning, and how is that learning being undertaken, right? So how is it that the Zapatistas are learning, quote unquote, as they say, learning a new way of doing politics? And of course, the point is it's also an invitation for us as we think about it, we examine that, again, without narrating the Zapatistas, we can also ask ourselves, and then what is it that we need to do to claim a space, to organize a space, and to learn together about a new way of doing politics. So I want to play with that idea just a little bit and talk about how a Zapatista civic pedagogy kind of might be examined. And I'm going to be really brief because I'm going to run out of time here. So the idea is just to kind of think of a Zapatista civic pedagogy in at least two ways. One way is to think about how the Zapatistas have organized themselves around learning and around research, and what that looks like over their kind of emergence since 1983 to the present. Another way to think about it would also be to kind of think of the elements of pedagogy, what constitutes an effective or successful pedagogy, and to kind of try to note what it is that the Zapatistas have been doing in terms of their own praxis that in some ways mirrors or can be described to some degree as a pedagogy. So it's partly an unnecessarily overstated theoretical formulation, and something to kind of just play with. It's not really all that necessary, and it's also important to remind ourselves that the Zapatistas don't narrate themselves this way. This is something that we're constructing. We're constructing in the way my friend Jorge Gonzalez at the lab complex at UNAM talks about an observable. So the idea is that we're not trying to construct a narrative and generate any kind of data around an ethnography, but try to construct an observable so we can understand more fully how the Zapatistas are engaging this new way of doing politics. So again, this is going to have to be, extremely brief, and just a quick overview. But we could think of the Zapatista civic pedagogy in terms of their emergence and their commitment to learning and research, and break it down into three key periods. So from 1983 to 1994, the Zapatistas, as everybody knows, the core group of organizers that went into the jungle were confronted, and they were confronted by two very powerful forces, the jungle and the indigenous communities. And they discovered, of course, that the indigenous communities didn't quite understand them and weren't so invested in what they were proposing as far as creating revolutionary cells and tried to, spark a revolution. So that was their kind of a critical moment of learning for them. And what of course had to happen was they had to learn how to learn and learn how to listen. And that learned to live in the jungle by learning how to learn from the indigenous communities and to listen to the indigenous communities. However, at the same time, of course, they still were working on some work that's traditional to the left, and of course they had to all learn Spanish, and they had to learn Marxist analysis, and then military drill. So there was quite a bit of learning kind of taking place in that moment. One of the most profound learnings that were undertaken in that moment as well was, of course, the question of women. That is in that period from 1983 to 1994 that some of the most complicated questions around women were kind of posed and explored. And of course that led to the declaration of the Revolutionary Law of Women in 93, and that's when we argue that the Zapatistas really kind of start their emergence become more visible, and that's the moment, the key turning point for the Zapatistas. The second period, from 1994 to, let's say, the present, is, 1994 to 2005. We could argue that, as in terms of a pedagogy organized around research and learning, that in that kind of key period, the Zapatistas, of course, after the first 12 days of the war, committed to a dialogue with civil society and to some degree committed to a dialogue with the Mexican state. And it's in that period, of course, that they organized themselves to learn more about what Mexico is going through, because they were worried that, of course, they may have misread the conjuncture and what was taking place. And, of course, they had now this kind of, they were engaging Mexican state in a radically different way than they had anticipated, and that they were going to have to dialogue, and eventually the key dialogue will be organized around the San Andres Accords. And then, of course, they were also trying to engage and to discover, to some degree, civil society, because they had committed to enter into a dialogue with civil society. And that's also a profound moment of learning, and it's a moment, then, of course, that we're able to participate and engage with the Zapatistas, and to some degree learn how to claim a Zapatismo and forge, if you will, forge a Zapatismo. And again, I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but the idea would be that that process of research and learning was organized through the various encuentros and encounters that the Zapatistas organized and have been organizing to the present, as well as the consultas and the marchas. Those are critical moments, those are key moments when they create space of learning and allow us to be in dialogue. And of course, they're learning from us as we're learning from them, and they're learning more about what's going on in the world and what's going on, of course, in Mexico. The third period is then, of course, the period that's more organized around autonomy and trying to learn more fully how to live a life that's autonomous outside of capital in the state. And of course, in that moment, they organized the caracoles and the juntas de buen gobierno, right? And that's a critical moment. Of course, encuentros continue, and in addition, there are seminars that they convene, connected with Universidad de la Tierra, Chiapas, and CEDESI, so that they're very active in organizing, again, several types of learning spaces. But it's also important to, I think, to kind of recognize that with the Juntas de Buen Gobierno and the Caracoles, they create a space and process of learning so that every member of the community and the network of extended communities is learning the arts of governance, because every member of the community is rotated into some formal position in the Junta de Buen Gobierno, and then active in maintaining the caracoles, which are a way to connect with the outside world and then to mediate problems and so on in the local areas in Chiapas, and manage the relations between the autonomous communities and other non-Zapatista communities. So I think, again, that's a critical moment to kind of think about how they've organized themselves around research, what we call convivial research, and insurgent learning. And what we mean by that, of course, is the idea that the Zapatistas have organized themselves in a way that the very way they're organizing their way of managing conflict, managing land, managing the question of women, dealing with the state and trying to put forward a proposal to change the democratic system radically so it allows for a collective subject. That process is managed through a dramatic reorganization of their society that is focused around learning and research in the Junta de Buen Gobierno and the various encuentros and the seminars. And that's a profound moment, and it's something that, of course, we took note of. So we could also talk about it in terms of a kind of playing around, being very playful. We can kind of talk about a pedagogy where, if I'm not mistaken, we should be thinking of a pedagogy in terms of a curriculum, right? we want to think of a curriculum. We want to think of curriculum. Curriculum, a key concept, an archive or research question, an assessment tool or assessment strategy, a facilitation strategy, and then, of course, a space of learning. So all of those, I think, are critical elements to any effective pedagogy or any kind of way of thinking about how we learn together. And I don't have time to get into in any great detail, but the idea is that we could think of the curriculum emerging out of the struggle that the Zapatistas have invited us to kind of engage with them. And of course, that's communicated by them through a collective ethnography that is then shared and circulated through the communiques, through the declarations, through the interviews, right? And we can also witness then how they're also examining how they're examining capital and capitalism in the state. And we see that most clearly, for example, in the Sixth Declaration. And what the Sixth Declaration, we see it in the Sixth Declaration in a kind of very basic way. And I suspect many of you have read the Sixth Declaration, are familiar with it. But it's a very sophisticated document, and you can think of it as a curriculum, as a text. Of course, it provides the overview or a historical overview of the Zapatistas from their own perspective, and it provides an analysis of the conjuncture, what was Mexico going through at the time that it came out in 2005. And then there's this section, number 3, how we see the world, that is a very sophisticated primer on capitalism. And of course, this document emerges out of collective processes where these are reflections that emerge out of the communities themselves over time. So it becomes a very useful document for ourselves, of course, so we can access that struggle and then also learn for ourselves, where we're, again, developing theory. These are reflections and actions that are coming out of struggle, they're coming out of action. So I don't know if you can see this better on your screen because it looks rather small, but this is a concept map that was developed by several collectives that I was active with. And this is a concept map that maps the third section on capitalism, right? So this is a way for us to create a system of information. And of course, for us, it becomes an assessment tool to be able to determine how effectively we are reading the Zapatistas. In this case, this section about capitalism and what they're saying. And again, I can't stress enough that section is as good a primer, as good an introductory study on Marx and Marx's concepts as there is, right? I'm often reading a lot of people who are writing about Marx and talking about whether Marx did this or that or the other thing. And this is the Sixth Declaration, the third section, a very sophisticated presentation of Marx's theory. And of course, it comes out of struggle. So I think it also, we can think of the, beyond a curriculum and the example of the Sixth Declaration, we can also think of key concepts, again, which those concepts kind of form part of the curriculum. Mandar obedeciendo, of course, is one of the most important here, but I would also like to think about dignity as a key concept. And one way we might think of how the Zapatistas have taken dignity and politicized it, kind of reclaimed dignity, and made it a kind of a central way of managing investigations and learning. We think of it in terms of kind of thinking about it as what we call a strategic concept. And for us, again, this is a concept map that kind of maps out what we mean by a strategic concept. But the idea of a strategic concept, we were able to develop listening to the Zapatistas in how they managed and how they claim dignity theoretically, politically, in their work, in their writing, in the communiques, again, in their collective ethnography. And if you think about dignity and the way how dignity is worked in the Zapatistas' hands, dignity first works fundamentally like a category of analysis. Of course, it allows us to identify where people are resisting and claiming a ya basta, right? It also creates or suggests or invites, if you will, a praxis. So if we claim dignity, if we exercise dignity, we want to exercise that dignity, we claim that dignity in a way that doesn't marginalize or extinguish the dignity of another. And this was, of course, a critical part of the politics of the spaces of encounter, of the encuentros. How do we arrive at spaces of encounter and, as Manish said, unlearn what it is that we've been learning in a Western context, and then, of course, learn how to listen, right? That's part of that praxis of trying to manage diversity. So that's a radically different notion than multiculturalism. It's a way of engaging diversity through a listening by first respecting very, very deliberately dignity, right? In that moment, when we're doing that kind of analysis, or we're moving forward and we're actually trying to engage a space, and we're doing exactly that. We're helping to construct a space. So dignity always constructs a space around it. Anytime people assert a dignity, they create a new space around it. That space and the interaction in the assertion and claim of that dignity always produces new knowledge. Always. There's no exception to that. So that's a powerful kind of notion. And the idea is then, of course, that for us, dignity works as a strategic subject. And it allows us, it's a tool, a convivial tool that can allow us to kind of help construct those windows, as Maria Carmen was saying on, I think, Wednesday now, that we can use dignity, and of course, as we're saying, it's a Zapatista civic pedagogy, and imagine it as a window so we have a more profound understanding of what's happening in a community without falling into the trap of narrating that community, but engaging that community and trying to identify a tool that they're making available. That tool then is maybe the idea, the possibility that we can use that tool in our own locales, in our own kind of regional areas. And then, of course, that's very much the kind of idea that Foucault and Deleuze were arguing about, how the localization of theory, and how theory kind of emerges out of local processes, and very much should be seen as toolboxes. Now, of course, that's Deleuze and Guattari. I just want to kind of name drop some French theorists there, because I don't know, it's always good to name drop Foucault. A couple other elements quickly. So facilitation. Any pedagogy always needs to manage facilitation. I think we can play with this as well. Is the idea of Subcomandante Marcos, who's also now Subcomandante Galeano, is very much a facilitator, and that he's no longer who he was. He is the Subcomandante and very much the interlocutor with civil society, with the emerging Zapatista community globally. And of course the comandantes, and now increasingly Tacho and Moises, and the comandancia in general are very much, I think, to my mind, would be considered facilitators, and they're playing a kind of a critical role in making sure that key ideas are communicated, space is convened, right? People are able to participate and engage, and they're kind of aware of what's expected of them in the spaces of encounter. Again, the spaces of encounter that are being convened over the years by the Zapatistas in the marchas, the consultas, the encuentros, the seminarios. Again, I don't want to have time to mention all of those. A central part of the facilitation, of course, is also the agreements, the acuerdos that the Zapatistas use, and servir y no servirse, representar y no suplantar, construir y no destruir, obedecer y no mandar, proponer y no imponer, convencer y no vencer, bajar y no subir. Right? So, I mean, the idea that these are tools, we argue that these are very powerful, profound, convivial tools that make it possible for us to engage each other. And then, of course, these are intercultural and intergenerational tools that can be useful. I wanted to kind of start tying it together and talk about how what I've been trying to suggest is a Zapatista insurgent learning and a Zapatista convivial research, which is kind of the critical elements of the Zapatista civic pedagogy. How we have kind of tried to activate it and engage it in our own locale in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And that primarily has been through several kind of traditional solidarity collectives. We were part of Acción Zapatista. We remain part of Acción Zapatista. But one of our kind of more important efforts currently is the Universidad de la Tierra Califas. And just very briefly, I want to just mention, so Universidad de la Tierra Califas is not at all like what we imagine a traditional university would be. We have no building, we have no bureaucracy, we offer no diplomas or degrees, we have no classrooms, no money contaminates Universidad de la Tierra Califas. All we have, in essence, is ourselves. And Universidad de la Tierra Califas only exists when we actually gather. However, we try to organize our gatherings around very specific spaces of learning that are linked. This is what we would call the temporary autonomous zones of knowledge production. We kind of convene several different kinds of spaces and link those spaces. And of course, the idea is that we link the spaces with other spaces in the community. So we have a very basic structure in that sense, where we're trying to reconstruct or reinvent the social infrastructure of community. And we do that through tertulia, which is very familiar to this audience, no doubt. A tertulia is kind of an everyday space where we kind of take over a bar Fridays, the end of the week, and anybody can drop in and they'll get information about what's going on in the community, what's new, what are people worrying about. It's intergenerational. So we have a tertulia, then we have an ateneo. An ateneo, we can kind of take that from the Spanish anarchist tradition of a kind of a space of learning that's organized by workers. And in our ateneo, we organize our ateneo in a very basic way where we kind of think about the ateneo in terms of a convivial space of learning organized through agreements. And then one key agreement is that we organize a space around questions. So the space in terms of insurgent learning and convivial research is organized and activated around the questions that any participant, anybody who comes to the space can share. And that is the curriculum. The curriculum emerges out of those questions, right? Then, of course, the idea in the Ateneo is to try to think about what's happening in the community and what are the struggles that we're facing, and then organize various kinds of what we call tequios de investigación, kind of work projects where we kind of manage specific research around particular issues. And of course, the issue that we're working on most closely in the current moment is the low-intensity war that's directed at the Mexican-American, Latino community and the African-American community, and the militarized police violence that's you all are probably somewhat aware of that's happening in the United States. In addition to the Ateneo, then we have occasional coyunturas, where we imagine a coyuntura as a space of popular education. And it's also, of course, a moment where we can kind of get into more focus, more in-depth focus about what we want to research or what we're learning, how we're doing analysis about particular struggles, and so on. And then we also have occasional mitotes. And for us, a mitote is just that. It's a kind of a clandestine gathering of ritualized celebration where people drink and party and eat and dance. But we also share knowledge. We produce knowledge in the process of celebrating. And of course, that's also hopefully at times an intergenerational and intercultural space. So we have those four spaces that for us then work as what we're calling a social infrastructure of community. And the effort there is to try to reclaim that social infrastructure of community. And in the process, try to think about in that space that's, again, linked to other spaces in the community and network to other spaces in community, and think about how we can organize ourselves through learning and research to rethink how we're engaged in politically in our communities. And for us, of course, that is a question of rethinking about how we imagine democracy. So the space itself has to be horizontal, and it's a space that to some degree allows us to assemble. And that is something that we imagine that there'll be a day that we can all participate actively in the political process in a way that it's no longer mediated by the state or by any kind of system of voting, but that we have localized kind of rooted assemblies, right? When we started to think about Universidad de la Tierra and started to imagine Universidad de la Tierra, we initially imagined Universidad de la Tierra as what would we need to do to create everything that the university can do, to provide every resource that the university could provide. That was our initial kind of effort, and then we abandoned that and just then kind of committed to just very open, very informal learning spaces. And then, of course, the idea is that they function and they reproduce the social infrastructure of community as long as they're consistent spaces and accessible and very visible to the community. So we always meet in very public spaces when we actually gather. Before we actually undertook all of this effort, our first kind of step was to think about how we could actually activate Unitierra Califas in California and extend Universidad de la Tierra Oaxaca. And the question that we were struggling with was that, first of all, of course, that we're not as connected to the indigenous communities as the Universidad de la Tierra in Chiapas and Oaxaca. We do have connections to several indigenous communities in California, but not quite in the same way, with the same intensity that is true of Oaxaca and Chiapas. So we were asking ourselves, is this possible? Is this ethical? Is this appropriate? And so we, of course, asked Gustavo and the compas in Oaxaca and said, well, what do you think? Is this possible? Can we do this? And to our surprise, they said, of course, absolutely. By all means, go ahead. What's the problem? Just do it. And just organize yourselves as learners. It says, of course, we don't have any problem doing that. But our concern was as well, we started to think about Universidad de la Tierra as a cargo. What would it mean for us to think about cargo? And could we say that this is a cargo? Our effort to try to activate Universidad de la Tierra Califas, could we say it's something of a cargo? And to some degree, it's okay that it's a cargo for us with regards to what Universidad de la Tierra Oaxaca has said. They've said, yes, you have that cargo, and they're organized and they can say that. But in our own community, in San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland, we don't have assemblies. We're not organized in assemblies as the Zapatistas are, or some of the indigenous communities in Oaxaca that use cargo and tequio. We do not have an assembly and a relationship with an assembly that can designate a cargo for us, or designate us as having the obligation of the cargo in that context. So that for us was a profound challenge, because the idea, of course, was that we wanted to honor the cargo from Oaxaca, from Unitera, Oaxaca, but also try to construct the context and try to activate assemblies. And in that case, we had to and we're still in the process of relearning the habits of assembly in the United States and in California. And so that's very much what our task has been, to try to construct these spaces, these autonomous learning spaces, as critical moments where we can actually try to relearn the habits of assembly. And in that moment, we realized what we were really trying to kind of imagine and think about is, how do we transfer technologies across struggles? And for us, the very profound technology that we were trying to learn was the technology of the sistema de cargo and the sistema de tequio and the sistema de asamblea. And this became very clear for us in the escuelita, that the cargo and tequio and asamblea is very much rooted to how we organize ourselves around work, and how work is claimed in a way for the reproduction of the community. And of course, taking that kind of analysis very seriously about how these technologies are actually locally rooted in the cosmovision and the reality of indigenous communities. And the idea is, of course, how is it that we can transfer that technology? So we see cargo, tequio, ateneo, cargo, tequio, and asamblea as technologies, and they're technologies that we're not sure we've been able to manage and to fully claim. And of course, there's a lot of learning that we have to do in our own context to make that possible. And of course, you can see the other idea about claiming these as technologies is, of course, we're trying to be playful and subvert the very notion about technology, because we're at the very center of again, as I was saying, in terms of the Zapatista conjuncture, we're at the very center of the Silicon Valley, and very much, again, kind of symbolically and actually practically, we're at the center of the production of various technologies that are commodifying and privatizing our everyday life and the way we learn and the way we produce knowledge. So we want to disrupt that a little bit by kind of engaging more creatively and engaging more seriously how we're thinking about these technologies that are coming from the global south. And again, just to kind of reinforce this notion, and at that moment then, it's our refusal to narrate the Zapatistas as either heroes or failures, but to engage the Zapatistas and see, well, what kind of tools that they're making available, that they're forging out of struggle, that we can take and try to, appropriate and try to use for ourselves in our own specific locale, right? So it's a refusal to romanticize the Zapatistas in that sense. The idea is, what is the tool that they're making available? Dignity would be one way of thinking of it, as a political tool, as a political praxis. But again, asamblea, cargo, and tequio. And so for us, then we play with the idea to some degree, and in the Ateneos, then of course we have tequios de investigación that will emerge, where we're actually doing specific kinds of research process. This map, Jesus Christ. This map is pretty basic sociogram, and this sociogram in some ways represents what we do, and in other ways it represents an imaginary of what we do. So, for example, we don't have a Center for Appropriated Technologies. We don't have any kind of building or anything like that. Again, the idea is, when we convene and we organize ourselves in autonomous learning spaces, what we're doing is creating a social infrastructure to try to create and facilitate a relation, the way we're constructing a new relation, where that relation is organized around research and learning. And the very way we organize that research and learning is radically democratic, and then prefigures, if you will, it's a prefigurative moment of the actual assembly that we're hoping to finally be able to claim, where that assembly will displace the kind of traditional representative liberal democratic system, right? So we don't have a Center for Appropriated Technologies. The idea is, of course, we appropriate technology wherever we can and use whatever technology we're able to use. when we were able to. Yeah. Run out of time? Oh. Real quick, just a couple minutes. So this is another map, a concept map that kind of more fully maps out what Unitierra Califas is doing. I just wanted to mention really quickly. Really quickly, I lost sense of time here because it's very rigid up here. Behind the podium is very rigid. It's very uncomfortable. But so how to apply this to the Chicano Studies classroom? One way, this is a concept map of the very class that I'm facilitating currently. And this map was produced by all the participants. I don't like to use the word student, so I'm going to use the word participants. All of the students / participants have produced this map. Anyway, I just want to point out, so if we're going to try to apply some of these tools and some of the kind of wisdom that's coming out of these struggles, one kind of moment of reflection was then to rethink how we teach Mexican American history. And in this case, the idea is to refuse to narrate the Mexican American struggle within the U.S. context as either heroic or a failure, right? The idea is then to try to examine the Mexican American struggle in all its complexities, right? And then to invite the students to try to engage specific questions by kind of engaging a history of the present. And so what questions that they're facing and what struggles are they facing in the present moment, and then to try to read into Mexican American history for solutions or answers about how to engage that struggle in the present moment. So I'm not going to have time to get into it in any detail, but one concept then that we developed to avoid narrating Mexican American history in a way that mirrors U.S. history is to take the concept cultural citizenship from Renato Rosaldo and turn it into a strategic concept much the same way we did with dignity. And then it's a map then that the participants can follow throughout the course of the semester. And it's a 2-semester course, so throughout the course of the semester, year, they can engage different portions of this map and take up some of the tools that are available in this map. But I'm told I ran out of time. I didn't manage my time well. I wasn't too flexible up here. I apologize. Some of it sounded stilted because this platform is not so used to just talking. Go ahead.
Okay. Do you want to answer the questions
questions?
one by one, or
Huh?
do you want to answer the questions
Sure.
one by one?
Sure,
or
one by one.
one?
Yeah, one by one. Sure. Can you just translate for me any questions?
Okay.
Do you mind?
If you want to use this microphone.
We'll just use it.
Agradecemos las palabras de Manolo.